Hello and welcome to India's World. On February 26th, the UN Security Council unanimously approved a Russia-US proposed resolution endorsing a ceasefire plan for Syria. The ceasefire agreement signed at Munich was part of a negotiated deal based on the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 passed in December 2015. Although the ceasefire has broadly held up in the last 1 week, there is skepticism about it holding and there are reports of alleged violations. The question that we are asking today is whether this ceasefire can eventually lead to a political transition in Syria. To discuss this and more, we have with us three distinguished experts. We have with us Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan. He's a professor at Center for West Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. We have Mr. Waiel Awwad, a noted Syrian journalist. He's the Chief of Bureau of Syrian Arab News Agency in South Asia. Ambassador Pinak, Ranjan Chakravarty. He's been India's ambassador to Bangladesh and Thailand. He's also served in Indian missions in Karachi, Tel Aviv, Jeddah, Cairo, and London. I welcome all of you to this discussion. Professor Ramakrishnan, what does the ceasefire in Syria really mean on the ground? Is it geographically demarcated? Are there areas where there will be no military conflict, and are there areas where fighting can continue?
Yes, because the Jabhat al-Nusra and the IS were out of the ceasefire thing. The areas they control, are left open for bombardment and other things. And the possibility of different regions getting more powers in this chaotic situation is a very important possibility. The ceasefire was mainly aimed at supplies, humanitarian supplies going in there. That's the main objective that was stated. But then it should pave way for negotiations. The political dialogue has to happen, the Geneva process has to happen. The violations that were being hinted at, I think there is also a political thing here. If it holds, and in next week the Geneva talks restart, then everyone wants to have their cards open. And we are seeing reports of demonstrations in the rebel-held areas, the Kurdish area being more active, and accusations of ceasefire violations, etc. These are also attempts at getting their voices heard at this point of time.
So people are using the ceasefire to consolidate and strengthen their position,
yes,
for
and
negotiations.
Make them more visible.
Okay. Dr. Awwad, what challenges does the ceasefire in Syria pose to the three main parties in the civil war in Syria? That is President Assad's regime, those who are opposed to the regime and want a change, and the Islamic State in Iraq and Libya.
Well, I endorse what the professor said, but let me add something, because the fight is the skipping. It's a truce. It's a truce between two factions, which is a cessation of hostilities, which by itself is not a ceasefire. If a ceasefire, it should be between two different rival groups. But here you are having 1,000 group, which is latest estimate of the 1,000 group are fighting in Syria, including then the Syrian government and one side. So you have groups which already supported from outside. Those groups have already been hammered well by the Russian intervention. The Russian intervention by September have changed the paradigm of the war in Syria and have given the Syrian government the upper hand of retaking territories under those groups. We call it moderate, you call it hardcore. So this is they are suffering. So the IS and Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, have been excluded, yes, but there is also the responsibility of the Mistura, the UN Special Envoy, that he has to identify which other groups are in Syria, which is violating, which are called as a terrorist group, which they have failed till now. But I think this is fall in the category of the UN Security Council resolution. It has to be adhered to 254, which also speaks of a political process in Syria.
Absolutely. It talks of three things. Yeah. It talks of cessation of hostilities. It talks of access for humanitarian aid, and it talks of political transition.
The access of humanitarian aid is just a pretext to get the arms into Syria. Because if you look at the reports from Russia today, and they are saying now that the Turkish government till now is supporting and sending arms to al-Nusra inside Syria toward Aleppo.
But to be fair, Dr. Awwad, there have been instances where the Assad regime has been accused of not allowing humanitarian aid from reaching certain areas, and Turkey is not involved there.
No, see, that there is accusation from both the sides. I'm not trying to take a side on this. It's the Syrian people suffering. My point is here that you have different groups supported from different countries.
Yeah.
Every country have its own interest.
Yeah.
Turkey, if Aleppo fall in the Syrian government, they are out of the picture of Syria.
No, we are going to discuss the various countries.
What I'm trying to say here, they don't want Russia to win. That nobody wants Russia to emerge as a winner in the Middle East.
Okay.
Because that's even the European and the American have said it very clearly on this.
Okay. Now, Pinak, would you say that the present ceasefire does something very interesting? That it removes all confusion that Dr. Awwad is pointing to between moderate opposition to Assad and the terrorists. So those who are part of the ceasefire, cessation of hostilities, are clearly moderates. They want to negotiate. And those who don't want to negotiate, doesn't matter they're 1,000 or they're 999, they are terrorists, and therefore they are a fair game for military attack.
You see, these labels are very difficult in a confusing and complicated situation like Syria, where you have smaller rebel groups also fighting with different countries supporting them. And a ceasefire, when you talk about a ceasefire in an international context or international law context, you're actually looking at two major sides, and coming to an agreement for a ceasefire. So that is why the phrase cessation of hostilities has been used.
Yeah.
So that telling everybody, look, you have to stop firing. That is the first step. Stop firing, allow humanitarian aid, etc. to go on. But then you can't remove the politics out of it in one go. So humanitarian aid is also being manipulated by both sides. The propaganda war by the Western media is continuing, as you know, with Saudis and Turkish blaming the Russians for bombing hospitals, schools, etc. So that war is, that propaganda war is still on. The war on the ground, or the hostilities on the ground, has taken a bit of a, there's been a stop. And as far as the Syrian government is concerned, they are saying that everybody who's against me are terrorists. So who is a terrorist, who is not, who is a moderate?
But I'm saying the ceasefire agreement has clarified that moderates are those who are willing to negotiate. Yes. Terrorists are those who still want to use
Yes, but don't forget, the Americans wanted more groups to be included. But it did not happen because the Russians and others opposed, saying, look, ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, the two groups cannot be included.
Okay. We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the ceasefire in Syria and the prospects of political transition in that country. Professor Ramakrishnan, will this ceasefire hold, given the fact that, as Dr. Awwad says, 1,000-odd groups are not part of it? But my question really is, under what conditions or pressures can the ceasefire break down?
For the last 1 week, anyhow, the ceasefire was held.
Yeah.
In spite of minor kind of violation, minor compared to the kind of conflict that we had. The most important problem that's pointed out is the trucks are not able to deliver humanitarian aid, which is one of the most important stated objectives. Not only the Turkish government, many agencies say that the checks that the Syrian government is undertaking is taking too long, and so that's the government's way of also making things work, that the Russian and Syrian government's position is consolidated, and it has a strong upper hand in the whole process. The major problem would be the Kurdish elements are saying that there are certain violations there, but they say that the other groups accuse them of being very close to the government. And nobody knows what's happening.
The violations there are by Turkey or by...
Turkey.
It is mainly by Turkey.
Exactly.
So Turkey is the most important.
So can I take that question to Dr. Awwad? So what is the role that Turkey as well as Saudi Arabia could play in either sustaining the ceasefire or destroying it completely? Because the two of them seem to be acting in tandem.
Because they are knowing that they are losing on the ground. The problem is that the moment Aleppo is being liberated from surrounding area of where the roots are coming from, Turkey is supporting all this supplying line, cut. That means Turkey have lost Syria like they lost in Libya, like Egypt, like Tunisia, and also the Ottoman Empire thinking a doctrine in Erdogan head is gone.
But in recent times, they never owned Syria. So where's the question of losing Syria?
The problem is Syria was supposed to be, everybody written Syria off the map in August last year. When they knew that there is different groups you have created, then the Syria is already been divided, everybody took his share. Turkey is always Aleppo, eyeing Mosul. Israel feeling more comfortable to take 153 square mile of Syria because in Golan, they have already discovered the oil and they asked the Russian Putin for this. And you can see the Saudis are more worried because the first things they have told them, if President Assad remain in power, that means he will take on the Saudis. So these two are already doing the desperate move of creating a kind of an anarchy, more of interventions, militarily as well, threatening Syria, threatening Lebanon now, threatening the whole region, because this is the desperate move.
So they could act as spoilers.
They are spoilers. They are acting as a spoiler. It's nothing new. Everybody is saying it. The point I'm trying to raise here is that these people are more interested to disintegrate Syria.
Okay. So, Pinak, Turkey is a member of the NATO bloc. Now, could Ankara's political conflict with the Russians in Syria transform into a conflict between NATO and other regional players? Especially, could it become a conflict between a war between NATO and Russia?
I see that not happening because I think NATO will be very careful. Most of the provocations have come from Turkey, actually.
So why don't they control Erdogan?
NATO is built on the philosophy that if Russia attacks, then we will come to your assistance as a member of.
But why doesn't NATO control President Erdogan?
Well, they are, I think, applying some pressures, the Americans and others. But as we have noted, that Turkey and Saudi Arabia are acting as spoilers to some extent. Yep. But today, I think they will come under pressure from the US and the Russians not to do so. And I think partly they will fall in line. But then you've heard that Saudi Arabia is willing to send troops to Turkey and sort of trying to protect its flank from the other side. I think that Turkey's main problem is with the Kurds. Apart from the fact that they wanted to depose and remove, regime change, etc., and wanted to get rid of Assad, but I think their main worry still remains the Kurds. And you know what is happening within Turkey, the kind of bombings that are taking place, etc. Okay. Now, if the Kurds mobilize and coalesce into one group, that's bad news for Turkey. And Turkey is actually, in fact, the Russians have already complained that Turkey is firing and using mortars, etc., from across its border into the Kurdish areas.
Okay, Professor Ramakrishnan, is the agenda of the external forces, the foreign powers that have been drawn into the Syrian war, at cross purposes with each other? For example, are the US objectives and Russian objectives the same? Are the Iranian objectives and the Saudi objectives the same? And if they aren't, then what is the point of saying that this is the group that supports ceasefire in Syria? You may support cessation of hostilities, but you don't support the eventual outcome that it should lead to.
The interests are not the same. That's why the conflict has been going on for such a long period of time now. And because it's such a complicated conflict, where all the regional and international players are involved with differing kinds of perspectives and interests, it is somehow playing out. But in the ceasefire, what I found was, this opposition against the government being supported by the United States in its position on the ceasefire, the government and the opposition, leaving alone al-Nusra and ISIS because they want to bombard them, and it's not ISIS choice or Nusra's choice. So then there is an opportunity now created in spite of all the differences. The problem is what you have asked earlier about NATO. The gains that now under a ceasefire that the Kurdish groups are gaining and Turkey's interests are conflicting. And the Americans are in favor of the ceasefire, but they have to satisfy the Turkish.
Americans are working with the Kurds, actually.
With the Kurds. That's what I was hinting at earlier as well. And therefore, there is a whole kind of dilemma for the United States also, and it has been from regime change, it has to come to this kind of ceasefire and working with the government and so on. So if that kind of a dramatic transformation can happen with American foreign policy with respect to Syria, if the ceasefire can hold for some time, I think some political negotiations can happen. And the demonstrations that I found in the rebel areas were almost like, mobilizing for the coming elections or something of that sort. So there's other kinds of political signals being sent.
I'll come back to you, Dr. Awwad, but we need to take a break at this point. We'll be back in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the ceasefire in Syria and the prospects of a political transition in that country. But Dr. Awwad, you wanted to say something before we went to the break.
Yes, my point was here, see, we have to give credit to the American and the Russian for the ceasefire in Syria, whether you call it truce, ceasefire, end of hostility. The point here is very clear that if you have seen, despite being there was some kind of, violation to the ceasefire, it is holding. That means the American and the Russian are able to apply pressure on their partners on the ground.
Now go a step forward and tell me whether this ceasefire can lead to political transition in Syria.
That is a part of the process. That is what
that is true. That's what is expected. Yes. But will it on the ground
but there are two scenarios here.
Transition?
There are two scenarios we have to focus on. One scenario is that they wanted to see Syria status quo divided, make it look like Lebanon for the future, that Syria can be divided. The second scenario, which is now holding Syria integrity as a whole and let the election, let the peace process take its own course, let the Syrians decide their future. Even de Mistura have said it. Yes, I mean in a press conference, he said very clearly that let the Syrian people decide the future of their president who is supposed to be. So, but it is very important here to highlight the issues here that any kind of outcome of the ceasefire has to be followed by a political solution, and that is why it is a part of the pressure applied from the US. But here is again, the game plan is very difficult. The game plan is that you create a crisis, you manage the crisis. You don't find a solution. That's what happened in Iraq. There will be a division. There will be happening in Syria for the future. I'm worried as a Syrian that this could be leading to some more trouble because we have seen ceasefire violation and all. So,
Pinak, taking off from what Dr. Awwad is saying, would you say that political transition in Syria will remain extremely contentious because there's resistance from political opposition within Syria and there's resistance to a solution from the regional players in that area?
Let me give you the worst case scenario first, which is a virtual partition of Syria into autonomous zones. You may have peace. You may have peace and ceasefire may hold, cessation of hostilities may hold, but each group holds on to its territory along with the arms, etc., that they have. But they happily live ever after kind of a situation. But that's not going to happen. Now, the other is that you actually have a political discussion and a political solution, which obviously will be very contentious because there will be demands from the West that Assad step down, etc. Russia and Iran will say, no, why should Assad step down? Let his party or his group also fight the elections, etc. But there is a possibility, I think, of that happening under international supervision, elections, etc. But it's a long way off still, I think.
But why should President Assad and his party negotiate their own hanging? I mean,
no, they will not.
They will not. So therefore, you'll have to have a transition where people who control such a sizable portion of Syria are a political force. You can't deny them completely. But really, how long do you think President Assad will last? Or could his party elect somebody else?
I think a way out can be found on that because I'm not thinking of Assad staying there for a long haul. The best political opportunity that comes at the earliest will be chosen.
Yeah.
And they have to make it in such a manner that it's not under compulsion from the West or any of them. That I think they can do, and parliamentary elections and many other things are there in between. So it can be done in a way that it does not sound as if
But it also has to be a legitimate a transition that is legitimized by certain democratic processes.
Right.
3 people can't sit in a smoke-filled room, or 30 people can't sit in a smoke-filled room and say, now remove X, bring Y.
No.
We've seen what happens when that kind of a thing is done. We've seen it in Afghanistan, for example.
Everywhere, the removal of Saddam, for example.
Yes, in Iraq.
So then, so that kind of an option, that's what happened with the United States and its allies. That it did not hold on to its earlier position mainly because of that.
Okay, so Dr. Awwad, people are saying the worst case scenario is a division of Syria. But isn't that the plan B that the Americans and the Russians are working on, perhaps?
No,
because as it is, the western part of the country is supported by, held by, say, President Assad, but supported by Russia, Hezbollah, and Iran. And the eastern part is held by the Arabs and their allies. So de facto, there is already a division. So will it become de jure?
See, the irony of the matter, there are 2 issues which is now coinciding with. One is that we are entering the 6th year of war in Syria, where the Syrian government have survived despite all the odds, despite all the hundreds of mercenaries, 100,000 came from 100 countries. We survived. There is a popular support for the president. Let him get it. Let the people decide the future of Syria. That's one issue. That's a political process. The second part, which is more important, that we are also coinciding with the century-old Sykes-Picot Accord.
Yep.
Syria is not in isolation. It is a disintegration of the Arab world into different states. It's a part of the strategy for the West and for the US and for Israel to see that Syria and other part of the Arab world have been divided. Iraq is going to be divided into 3. It's already de facto. So the American understanding with the Russian is they have already divided their strategic doctrine. There is a strategic, they are already differ on the objectives. The difference between US and the West, with the West and Russia, is the objective of the aims, how to approach, how to reach it. So Iraq will be divided into that. Syria will be heading for this. Libya is already going into 5. Sudan, it is a 2-story. Egypt is heading to this. So if we see the disintegration of the Arab world, we should not see Syria in isolation of the whole crisis in the Middle East. I think this is the point I'm trying to raise.
No, I was surprised to see one slogan of the demonstrators in the rebel-held areas, that the Lavrov-Kerry agreement, the ceasefire agreement, is similar to Sykes-Picot agreement.
Exactly.
They were saying,
That's the new Sykes-Picot.
So they're taking division for granted.
Granted.
Yes.
It's a worrisome.
Okay, so we are running out of time. So, Pinak, can Syria avoid partitioning by asking all the parties involved in the ceasefire to respect the UN Security Council resolutions, which specifically talk of a unitary and secular Syria? Is that a realistic proposition?
My sense is that given left to the Syrians, they will probably want to stay together. And they would want to avoid partition. But how to get there is obviously the million-dollar question. Who stays, who goes? I would also not put out, exclude from the realm of probability that Mr. Assad and his family find a comfortable home somewhere else, and that there is a transition to another generation of Syrians for the sake of the larger goal of keeping Syria together and bringing in peace in the long term.
Will Syria stay together? What's your hunch?
It can stay together. The worst case scenario that was already mentioned. In between is the federal kind of, solution.
Some kind of autonomy.
Last word to you, then we are running
I think we survived for thousands of years. I don't think we should survive with the age of every president or every leader in the Arab world. We have survived for thousands of years. Let it go. It will come back. We will stay together. We will be together. No, cannot divide Syria. Syrians have stood together for the fighting against this terrorist Takfiri Wahhabist group which have really infiltrated in Syria. That is why the president survived. And that's why the people give him the popular support.
Yeah,
Let the people decide.
All
It
right.
can stay
On
as
that-
a unified country.
Yes, it can. I mean, I'm not ruling it
motivated
out.
power.
That's what
So
I said.
on that happy note and wishing for Syria to stay together, we have to end this discussion. I'd like to thank all of you, Ambassador Pinak, Ranjan Chakravarty, Dr. Waiel Awwad, Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan. Thank you very much for participating in this discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week as usual. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching India's World.